All right, so we left off. I think I had shown you this slide. So we started kind of talking about costs, revenues to teams, thinking about the optimal number of wins versus profit versus win maximizing. So we'll kind of revisit that a little bit today with something called revenue sharing, which should help you kind of answer the last two questions on that homework assignment. So after today, we should have everything we need to kind of get through each one of those problems. But when we think about revenue, like total revenue is across several markets, right? So last class, we kind of talked about the ticket market. You can think about total revenue from ticket market would be just price of the ticket times the quantity of the ticket, right? However, we even mentioned some ideas about sacrificing revenue from tickets because you can potentially make it up in other areas, right? So we try to break total revenue down. There's kind of 5 main categories. Obviously, if we wanted to, we could start to get into really specific categories here and make this a lot more than 5. Kind of the main 5 are gate receipts or ticket sales, the broadcasting rights, which we'll talk a little bit about today. Sometimes it's not just the team making these broadcast rights, it's the team getting some revenue from the league selling these broadcast rights. Licensing income, once again, usually done through the league, but kind of some of it is team specific. And then of course, venue revenue. So this is anything other than tickets that's sold in the stadium. We could break this down into several categories: concessions, naming rights, additional ad space sold in the stadium, partnership deals. And then the last one is kind of this revenue sharing, or what was sometimes called league transfers. Okay. So, we could, all I did was try to come up with a clever subscript for each one of these to try to, identify where it's coming from. We ultimately usually won't write this completely out, but just to kind of as a starting point. So we really looked at the ticket market already and kind of how that operates and how a firm would maximize total profits just in, ticket sales, right? We're kind of looking at the marginal revenue of the last ticket sold being equal to the marginal cost. We talked about they typically have monopoly power here, and we worked through those models. So just something, to start to think about kind of some differences across these main 4 leagues. So I typically kind of try to reference the NFL, NBA, MLB, and NHL. There's obviously other leagues and they have their own specific rules, but there's enough variation across those main 4, and they're the 4 largest, right? So, if we look at NFL, NBA, NHL, there's not quite as much variation when we're looking at their ticket revenue. If we think about specifically NBA and NHL, why might we not see as much variation in ticket revenue? What's one thing that's pretty constant across all teams in those 2 sports that might not be constant in, say, Major League Baseball? So they're all playing in what type of building, right? An arena, right? Those arenas are typically, there's not near as much variation in the capacity of these different arenas. Now, NFL, I think you could argue, if we look at different football stadiums or Major League Baseball, there's a lot more variation in just stadium capacity, which, right, the stadium capacity is going to limit sales, right? The best teams in the NBA are only going to be capping out at a much lower number than some of the best teams in the Major League Baseball or NFL, just because there's larger capacities, right? So we don't see quite as much variation just in terms of tickets sold or total revenue, but there is some, and I think I've got some graphics here in a little bit. So I think the highest gate revenue across these 3 leagues we were looking at is New York Knicks at 130 million. And then kind of the Rangers gate revenue, I believe the NHL was the highest at 104. If you think about also why might the NFL, despite having probably some of the larger capacities, not be earning as much total ticket revenue as Major League Baseball? Way less games, right? So, there's a factor of 10 times more games. So it would have to be that a factor of 10 times more people are attending each game. We look at the numbers, that just generally doesn't play out. I mean, the capacity differences aren't that great. And so over the course of an entire season, we're going to see ticket revenue, or at least in terms of the number of tickets sold, right? We could kind of, even though they're stuck at capacity, NFL teams can increase the price, right? So they may be able to make up some of it with the price, but definitely not if we just look at the tickets sold. So if we look at kind of Major League Baseball, there's a lot more variation. So the highest team in Major League Baseball, and I think this is a couple of years old, 2018 was the last time I could find data that I was pretty convinced came from a good source. And there we had almost $250 million for the New York Yankees and 28 for the Rays, right? So, I mean, there is significantly more variation in Major League Baseball ticket revenue, right? But kind of the averages or the medians look pretty similar across the leagues, right? So we've got pretty similar kind of median team ticket revenue earnings across these leagues. It's just there's a lot more variation in Major League Baseball. So we talked about a little bit about this already, but like what's causing these differences even within the same league? Well, we have capacity differences. We've already looked at how that kind of influences the price and quantity of tickets sold. The number of games is just going to be kind of taking what your optimal kind of price quantity is and just that's what it's getting multiplied by, right? Like the revenue per game times the number of games would give you total revenue there. Right? One thing that it's a little bit harder to get data on and really break down, although I've had a couple of people reach out to me for projects and just me looking for different data sets. I have stumbled across a couple of data sets that have collected some leagues' ticket prices. So you can kind of see how, even if, what's a good example? I guess we'll use, I don't know, I would imagine like Lambeau or Soldier Field, even when their teams aren't great, probably sell a high number of tickets. And so if they're selling out most of their games, what's the only way they can increase their revenue? Well, they're hitting that vertical supply curve. All they can do is increase the price as demand increases. Right? So ticket prices are another way that it's causing some of these differences. And then we'll talk a little bit about revenue sharing here. So some of the money made in ticket revenue might be taken by the league and then kind of redistributed to the teams that aren't making as much. So if we're looking at kind of final revenue numbers, sometimes it doesn't have whatever that amount that was taken by the league is. Okay? So how does this revenue sharing done? It depends on the source of revenue. So specifically in terms of ticket revenue, different leagues have different rules. So the NFL's is probably kind of the most simple, right? But basically whatever your gate revenue that you make, right, your ticket revenue, you keep, I think is it 60? Yeah, so you keep 60% of it, right? So you keep 60% of the revenue. The rest of it goes to the league and then redistribute it evenly to every single team. Now, the way in which this is done is every team pays in and then the league redistributes it. But, if you wanted to figure out how much revenue is coming from, say, choose your NFL team that you're in Indianapolis Colts, you would take their gate revenue. They keep 60%. The remaining 40% is redistributed evenly to every team. So they get a little bit of it back, right? I guess 0.4 over 32 comes back to them. So technically they're keeping a little more than 60%, but it's because the procedure in which it's done is everybody pays in and then it's redistributed. Okay. So you can kind of see, there's not as strong of incentive to really increase my ticket revenue. I mean, it's not, I'm getting to keep every single dollar. I'm getting to keep about 60 cents on the dollar there. Excuse me. Major League Baseball has a pretty similar rule, but they get to keep 69%. But it's not just gate revenue that they have to, pay in 31% to the league. It's all kind of local revenue as well. So any kind of local broadcast deals or anything like that, they're also having to give up 31% of that to the league to then be redistributed evenly. Right? And then the NHL, we could Google and look it up. I forget, the numbers aren't as clean. It's a little bit specific to exactly how the revenue. I think they even treat concessions different than ticket revenue there. So they really break it down, making it a little more complex about exactly what percent of the revenue you get to keep depending on how it was earned. Okay. So why do you think we would want to have a revenue sharing rule like this? What's one thing we kind of talked about last class or looked at, even just in the, let's think about two teams, right? Have the exact same stadium capacity, but one of them faces a much higher demand because they're in a large market. Well, we saw that higher demand would lead to either higher ticket sales or at the very least, higher ticket prices. Right? And that kind of shift or that increase in demand. Okay? So we always know those teams are going to be an advantage. Now, I think I've alluded to it before, and we'll definitely dive deeper into it later this semester. But one of the things that is going to be driving a lot of these leagues is that the overall demand for their sport depends on how balanced it is. Right? If I've got two teams that are, the quality level is insanely higher than the rest of the remaining 30 teams, every time those two teams play, it's not going to be a very interesting game, right? And people aren't going to want to tune in. You kind of already know what the outcome of the game is going to be. If you follow like NFL at all, like this last year, I don't have any desire to watch a Jets game, right? It doesn't matter who they play. I kind of already know, like, they're probably going to lose. It's not going to be that great of a game. And so they want to try to have the quality be pretty consistent across the teams. If you look at, like ticket sales and ticket price data for like UFC events or boxing events, it's always much higher when they have matchups where like the betting odds are closer to 50-50. People are just more innately interested in things where they don't know the outcome or there's an unexpected outcome. So if my large market teams, right, are always going to be able to kind of generate higher revenues and in turn spend them on player salaries and increase their quality, I'm going to start to get a pretty imbalanced league, right, or unbalanced league. And so by doing this revenue sharing, I can take some money from these larger markets and it gets redistributed to those kind of smaller markets. It's almost the same idea as like an income tax, right? You tax the wealthy at a higher percent, and then you can kind of redistribute that. Well, what you should be doing is redistributing that to kind of the lower income classes, right? So that you kind of get a more equal income distribution. Right? Is that making sense? Any questions on that? We'll dive into exactly how this will kind of influence the teams here in just a second. So another kind of main area that we can be interested in is broadcast revenue. And once again, we'll start to see some differences and start to really think about differences across these markets. So the NFL has only national contracts, right? So they make kind of all the televised game deals, right? It's not like, it's not like the Chicago Bears have their own deal with local networks, right? The NFL makes all of the broadcast kind of deals, sells all the broadcast rights to these games. So, what's one way that I could potentially increase the amount of revenue that I'm making from kind of selling off these broadcast rights is potentially to try to start packaging my games into several products. So if I just, back in the day, if you go back far enough, I think even before, we probably have to go back to like the 80s, but it used to be that Fox and CBS, those were the only two companies that the NFL sold the rights to the games to, right? And then eventually they started kind of packaging. They said, well, look, we know that some of these games are have a much higher demand, right, for people to watch these games than other ones. So how can we create, right? How can we make these games that'll have high demand where like maybe two high quality teams are playing each other? How can we make more money off this? And they just started to repackage these deals. So they'd only sell broadcast rights to Monday night games to a specific corporation. I think, am I remembering incorrectly, is ESPN doing the Monday night games now? Yeah, so ESPN has the Monday night games. Sunday night games, sell that off to NBC, right? We'll still sell, the kind of regular games that we're not, if you look at the games that are on Monday and Sunday nights, what would it be optimal for the league to try to do before the season? They believe those are kind of time slots where broadcast companies will pay more money for. If I can give them a high quality game, right? I try to get my highest quality teams into those games. And then I sell off kind of the less demand games as like a package, right, to CBS and Fox. And then what do? I'm going to start doing Thursday night games, right? Or, you start selling off these different packages to products of games to different broadcast corporations, as opposed to selling them all just to one or two, right? So we've seen this. I think the most recent number I could find from a legitimate source was the Thursday night games, where the last time they were purchased was $3 billion over 5 years. So they must believe that there's a lot of money. The broadcast companies believe there's a lot of money to be made off ad revenue, right? So these are, not small numbers here. I think it was, so 55 million a game if you work out how many games they actually get there. You look at just the total broadcast revenue, and I tried to update these numbers the other day. So I think 19.7 billion was the total broadcast revenue that the NFL brought in. Now, the way it works is they have a deal with the Players Association, or the kind of essentially the union, where the players are getting, guaranteed to get 9.4 billion of this, and the owners or kind of the teams keep about a little bit more than half as well, so 10.3. So there's a lot of money being made every single year just off selling these broadcast rights, right? If we compare this, right, in 1 year, 19.7 billion. Even if I take, I don't know, the average here, let's assume it was like 50 times 30, right? So 0, so what? 1.5 billion. So every year, maybe you're getting 1.5 billion in ticket revenue, whereas the broadcast revenue, I guess you could, figure it out. It's about 321 million per team. So it's still pretty substantial, right? Ticket revenue is still generating more money for the average team, but there's a lot of money that each team is getting from this broadcast revenue annually as well. Okay. One thing about kind of the way that this broadcast revenue is shared, when you have a structure where the league is making the deals and allows for no team to make their own individual deals, like the Bears can't sell off the rights to their games or televised games, is that you make sure that market size doesn't matter. All the revenue coming from broadcast revenue here in the NFL, they just distribute it evenly across every team. So this is one of the advantages of allowing the league to just make these huge kind of national contracts, right? Is that you get no kind of market size influencing how much revenue each team gets, which then leads to, improving the competitive balance or kind of the quality level of the teams is a little more consistent. Okay. So some other leagues we can kind of start to think about, well, what happens if I decentralize the selling of these broadcast rights, right? So Major League Baseball has these national contracts. So they've got Fox, TBS. I'm sure they've had some other ones over the years, or even that I'm not aware of right now, right? They do make these national kind of, or these deals for the league, right? Sell off packages of games. So I think, it's much lower, right, than the NFL. They're not getting kind of near as much, 25 million per team instead of 300, but it still tries to help correct for the fact that there's differences in market size. And, if let's, for instance, say the New York Yankees were to sell off the rights to their games, they're going to be able to do that for a much higher amount than if, who do we want to pick on now? The Seattle Mariners, sell off the rights to their game. It's just a much smaller market. Okay. So, that's good. They're following the NFL and they're trying to make sure that there aren't differences. The problem is they also allow for teams to make local TV deals as well. So I don't know if any of you grew up anywhere close to Chicago, but right, like the White Sox had a deal with, I forget, the stations changed every so many years, but it was WB for a while, and then it was something else. But they channel 26 is all I remember. But they used to sell the rights to them, so they can make local deals with some local TV broadcast companies or regional sports networks. However, they only get to keep same kind of idea. They get to keep 69% of it, right? Just like the ticket revenue in Major League Baseball, and they have to share 31%. So this is good. Like, they're trying to do this revenue sharing so the team doesn't get to keep all of it. They're trying to make these national contract deals, right, where they evenly give it to all the teams. But if you allow teams to do local broadcast deals, what's going to be the byproduct of that? Well, blackouts, right? They might have to when those are usually in the national broadcast deals, but in terms of the kind of quality consistency across the team or the league, what would allowing them to do local deals kind of lead to? Yeah, right. If my team is located in Chicago or New York, there's going to be a lot more money to be made when making some local deals than if I'm in, Jacksonville or, choose your kind of small market city, right? So in the Major League Baseball, we will see some more variation or discrepancy in terms of revenues when it comes to the broadcast revenue that teams are kind of receiving. Now, like I said, there's a lot of it being shared evenly from the national contracts. And, even if I make my own local deals, I still have to share 31% of it with the league. And then that goes out evenly to the teams. But there still is that 69% that's going to cause some differences across the teams there. One kind of way of, interesting thing to relate to some other economic principles you might see is this idea that local TV deals are pretty good examples of vertical integration. So vertical integration is the idea that, for instance, if I'm, Shell gasoline, right, and I have crude oil, I have refineries, and I have distribution networks, I don't have to buy any one of those intermediate products along the way to then provide, gasoline at a gas station, right? I'm not paying someone for distribution. I'm not purchasing it from oil refineries. It's all my product. And so I can basically sell it to myself at cost, right? There's no markup, right? Whereas, if I'm not Shell gasoline, like maybe I just want to open up a gas station, I'm going to have to purchase, I'm going to find a distribution network. They're going to charge me a little bit above whatever it costs them. the oil refineries where they're getting the oil from, they're going to have a little bit of a markup. And so with vertical integration, you can kind of decrease your costs, right? Because you own these intermediate inputs, right? So the way you can kind of think about this playing out with local TV deals, and the best example we have of this is probably the Braves and TBS, is that the Braves sell off the rights to the local, to TBS to televise their games and make kind of this local deal. But TBS isn't going to have to pay kind of a markup, right? Before, the Braves would have had some monopoly power, so they could have kind of charged a higher price because they know that, whatever broadcast company it was would be willing to pay a higher price at whatever that number of games they wanted to sell them was. But if I own the TVs, if I own the broadcast company and the baseball team, I just say, well, yeah, I'll just, whatever, I'll just sell you the games at cost. I'm not going to kind of have any monopoly power against myself, right? And so it basically lowers the costs to these broadcast companies if they're both owned, if the team is owned by the same person as a broadcast company. And then it results in being able to kind of increase profits for that, whatever network is kind of purchasing those games at cost, as opposed to this kind of markup that would exist from monopoly power if they didn't own both of those things. So, we see it, like I said, we got the gasoline example is a good one, but we kind of see it play out here. Specifically, like I said, the Braves and TBS, but there's probably a couple other examples where I'm sure that they don't own the entire team, but right, they might have some part ownership in a team as well as some local broadcast networks. So, if I look at Major League Baseball, I kind of mentioned like there is going to be some discrepancy. Notice LA, just the amount of money they're making from their local TV deals, significantly greater than teams like Miami, Tampa, Colorado, Kansas City, right? And I think this is a little bit older data. I couldn't really find anything that was any newer than 2016. And the bulk of, if I'm going from like the 20 teams in the middle, there's not a ton of variation there. It's really these kind of extreme ends of the distribution where we're really getting a lot of variation. Okay. So maybe this explains a little bit, partially why teams like in LA, like the Dodgers, can have so much additional money, right? And how maybe because we have this variation existing, we'll end up kind of thinking about maybe why some leagues or what might be attractive about capping the amount of money that teams can spend on their players and things like that. This is another interesting graph from that same year. I just figured I'd throw in here, but you can kind of see this was like, and it's hard to get the actual data on this. And so this is why like the data is a little bit older, but some of these teams in 2016 reported their cable TV revenue. So here each dot represents, a team, how much money they got in local TV, or sorry, cable TV revenues on the y-axis, and then just the population size here is on the x-axis. So we think about that like as the market size there. So you can kind of see if I drew a line of best fit through this data, it kind of has this slight increasing, or a positive slope, that being in a larger market is going to lead to kind of higher revenues. So large market teams, once again, have an advantage in this area of generating more revenue as well, right? We talked about in the ticket revenue, broadcast revenue, both they'll have an advantage. So I won't spend too much time on this, but the NBA and NHL are very similar to Major League Baseball. It's just that they make it so that if you're in a large market, you can really prosper off of this local broadcast deals, because you don't have to pay 31% into the league. You get to keep all of it, right? So if we think about getting to keep all of that local revenue, should that make revenue more or less equitable in terms of local broadcast revenue across these teams in the NBA and the NHL? What would a rule like this actually do? Yeah, if they get to keep all of it, now it's just going to drive those discrepancies even more, right? So we would expect to see even greater variation here in these two leagues, making the difference in large market teams much larger. So I think if we looked at the NBA, the lowest team is 9 million and the highest team is 150. This is an insane discrepancy, right? It was pretty big in Major League Baseball, right? We're talking about, looks like approximately 20 million, 25 million, to 200. But right, there's still significant variation there in the NBA. And we probably could curtail that a little bit if we kind of had a rule where they have to at least share some of their local revenue.
Would that change with like team success? Like, for example, like 2 years ago, the Suns, they would have like 3 national games, but now since they're successful, they have like 30.
So these, right, aren't their nationally televised games.
Okay.
So the nationally televised games, which they do, MLB or the NBA does make those would be, that's the revenue that gets shared evenly with every single team.
Okay.
So it's actually better for the league when your small market teams are doing well, because even when they're doing well, they can't translate that into high local broadcast deals. But if they are doing well, the team or the league can sell those, those are part of the games that are being sold. And so that they're getting kind of these national broadcast revenue instead, and they don't have to rely on kind of that local broadcast revenue from those small markets. But yeah, if you think about when the league makes these huge national company or contracts with national broadcast companies, they're definitely that's definitely going to be influenced by the quality level of different teams. And there's actually an argument to be made. So if I'm a national broadcast company and I want to buy the rights to a game, would I rather be, and let's say that quality is constant, right? Would I rather be putting a game on where it's the Los Angeles Lakers versus the Chicago Bulls, and let's just assume they're equal quality, or would I want to have, what can I pick on? The New Orleans Pelicans versus, it's another kind of small, Indianapolis Pacers. And let's assume all 4 teams are like the exact same level of quality. Which one of those games would I rather have as CBS or Fox? Yeah, why?
Because they're a high market team.
Yeah, I know their fan base is so much larger. LA and Chicago's fan bases are so much larger than those other 2 cities. So in a weird way, it's actually advantageous for the leagues to a degree. So this isn't why all revenue is shared equally, because when they make these national broadcast deals, they want the primetime games to be their largest market teams. They actually want a little bit of that discrepancy to still hold, because they know that broadcast companies are going to pay more if those large market teams are good. So there's, kind of this trade-off, right? I want my large market teams to kind of be the highest quality, but I don't want it to be that they're so much better that the quality of the games when they play other teams starts to get where people aren't interested.
So like the Warriors, how like about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, they were a small market team.
Mm-hmm.
Since they did so well, they're now like a large market team.
So
for like the Bucks, how they have Giannis.
So there's going to be changes year to year in the interest level in the teams, right? Depending on the quality of the players. When we're talking about market size is the idea that even if the team is bad, they're still going to have the opportunity to generate high revenues, because like any team in New York, right? It doesn't matter, choose your team in New York or LA. It doesn't matter how bad they get. There's always going to be a big market for it. So that's maybe the way more to think about market size. But yeah, there'll be changes year to year based off of quality as well. So what was I saying? So the national broadcast deals, right? We're looking at NBA versus the other leagues. Pretty big gap between the highest and lowest team. And then you can kind of notice in the NHL, when they're making these local broadcast deals, much lower revenue amounts than the other leagues. And so there's not quite as much variation there. Right? So now's like an interesting point to kind of bring up this difference between attending a game and then when watching a game on TV. So these markets are kind of intertwined, and teams have to be concerned when they're setting prices about whether or not, they're going to get, if they, set the price of a ticket too high, maybe they'll get too many people to just switch over and watch the game on TV. Okay? So you can kind of think about, if I wanted to watch whatever my sports team I'm interested in play, when do I choose to attend a game versus when would I choose to kind of just watch it on TV or at a bar or wherever, right? So we think about what's the cost of attending a game. This one's kind of easy. So if I want to go attend a game, what's the cost there? The easiest part of the cost is ticket price. Though maybe there's some other costs too, like maybe I'm going to have to eat at the stadium. Maybe I have to pay for parking, right? So there's a package that I could kind of wrap up all of these things I have to purchase to attend the game and kind of put that all as the price, right? So you've got the ticket cost. Maybe there's an opportunity cost there, right? I'm taking time off work or I'm not doing something else. So we want to factor that in. But once we have that cost of attending the game, what's the cost of watching the game on TV? Well, same kind of idea there. If I assume that, I'm not going to be at work, right? I'll have an opportunity cost of not working. But really, other than that, it's just going to be the cost of electricity or, my cable bill or whatever it is, right? And so we can kind of think about, we could come up with a price to attending the game and a price for watching the game on TV. I then think about, okay, so why would someone choose to go to the game, even though we know that if we're just looking at these costs, the costs are much higher, right? So I've got the price of attending the game and the price of watching the game on TV. Right? So when we make decisions, and I don't know exactly what you went over in 201 or if you've had intermediate micro, if you've kind of, might recognize this. When I'm making decisions about what to do, right? I'm not just concerned with the price, right? The price of I don't know, a 1995 Geo Prism car, like if you even recognize what that is, like it doesn't matter how low the price gets, I probably don't want to purchase it. Why? Because the benefit I would get from that is very low, right? So it's not just the price that you care about when you're thinking about purchasing something. It's going to be the additional utility that you get as well, right? So there's going to be an additional utility or a marginal utility or benefit, if you want to think about it that way. Utility is kind of this, a little more of an abstract term, but the marginal benefit or marginal utility that you get from attending the game and the marginal utility you get for watching the game on TV, you'll choose the one where that marginal utility, the additional utility you get per dollar you spend is greatest. Essentially, where am I getting the most bang for my buck, right? The largest amount of additional benefit or additional utility from each dollar I'm spending, okay? So we know that the price of watching the game on TV is significantly lower. So the only way that people aren't choosing to always watch the game on TV is if that marginal utility is also lower, right? So, generally, we think about the benefit of watching the game on TV versus the benefit of attending. Typically we think about that being lower, and it has to be lower if people ever decide to go to the game, right? If my marginal utility, so let's assume we had this scenario where I've got someone, and I don't know, I think I could argue my dad's a little bit like this, but right, to attend the game is almost more of a task for him than just watching the game on TV, right? He'd be probably happier. He would gain an additional, more additional utility from sitting at home watching the game than he would having to try to find parking, walk through the crowds, all those stuff, right? So if this is ever the case, well, I know that if the margin utility of watching the game on TV is greater and the price of watching on TV is lower, then this would always be the case. So if there's ever anybody out there who values watching the game on TV more than attending, they'll never attend a game unless somehow like the price of attendance gets to be where someone like gives them a ticket, right? I mean, if the price got low enough, potentially they might attend the game because, right, the only way that the price of attendance is ever going to be lower than the price of watching the game on TV is if I'm given the ticket or something like that. Right? Yeah.
And also, that would be like COVID, because how COVID showed up.
Yeah, so think about this way. Yeah, so for sure, usually, I kind of came up with this scenario just to kind of prove the point. More often than not, people value watching the game on TV a little bit less than attending the game in person, right? But what's something that might have changed that? Maybe the fear of getting some disease that potentially could kill you, right? So maybe for a lot of people, this additional utility, think about it as when you're making the decision to go to the game, it's like your expected utility. So you would factor in how much you would value being at the game with this additional risk of like a negative value if I get COVID, right? And so you would really have this like expected utility, and then potentially you could get that swap to where the additional benefit of attending the game is now lower because I have this thing I have to worry about. Yep. No, it's actually a really good way to think about this decision to attend games or not. Now, it's hard. We can't really analyze that too much in the first year because teams just didn't allow people to go. But yeah, even today, I would argue you probably see a little bit of that playing out. right? So we've got this idea that you know, if I'm going to attend the game, it has to be that the marginal utility per dollar I spend is going to be greater than the marginal utility per dollar I would spend to watch the game at home on TV. All right. Any questions at this point? We're starting to think about this marginal utility per dollar. You know, so what happens if someone gets, you know, similar margin utility from both? Well, there we know the price is probably higher for attending the game, and so unless ticket prices fall enough, they're just going to choose to stay at home and watch the game on TV. All right, this was the idea that unless I get a ticket for free, like it's or for a very low cost, I'll probably just sit and watch it at home. Okay. So teams really enjoy making TV revenue, right? They love selling off the rights to televise these games, but right, they also really like to make money from concessions and ticket sales, right? So they know that people are wrestling with this decision. I can't sit at home and watch the game on TV and watch the same game in person at the same time, right? I have to choose one or the other. So what's something that leagues have done, someone already mentioned it earlier, that kind of prevents people from kind of having the opportunity to stay at home and watch the game on TV? Yeah.
Would that be like broadcast exclusivity or something? Like I can't watch it. I can watch all the Pacers games, but I can't watch a Lakers game without the NBA TV app.
Kind of. There's a specific term I'm looking for, but it's along the same ideas. A lot of these leagues, if they don't sell enough tickets, what happens to the game? Yeah, they black it out, right? So they black it out in the local TV market, so that kind of guarantees that, well, now if you want to watch the game, it's not on TV, right? And they only do that in the local market because you don't want to penalize people who, you know, didn't fly halfway across the country to come attend the game, right? You're really trying to get at your consumer base of people who would actually attend the game, right? And so we see these blackouts as a way to, you know, kind of guarantee that, you know, if you want to watch the game on TV, we need to make sure that we're selling enough tickets, right? And so kind of shutting down the opportunity to watch it on TV for local people, maybe you get more people then to attend the game, but you still have it kind of broadcasted nationally, right? I'll kind of go through this kind of quick, just some interesting numbers, because I really want to get at what revenue sharing looks like when it comes to choosing the optimal number of wins for these teams. So licensing revenue is another kind of big source of revenue, right? Leagues selling things like team logos, player likenesses, even video games like Madden, right? Having kind of paid to use the NFL's like official, you know, logo or symbol or whatever. The official use of logos on apparel. So I don't know how many of you have tried purchasing like sports apparel. There are a lot of companies over in China now where you can get online and buy from them. So why? Because they don't follow these rules, right? They'll use the official logo without paying the NFL anything, right? But if you're an American company and you want to produce this apparel and you don't pay the league to use it, like you're open to legal ramifications, right? Companies in China, not so much, right? They can kind of get away with it a little bit more. Not just China, but I'm just using them as an example. Somewhere over, you know, outside of the U.S. Okay. But for every company that is producing these official, you know, using the official logo, the official team, what would you call that? Not symbol, but you know, the official kind of icon. There you go. Thank you. I was at a loss for the word there. Official icon of these teams. You have to pay these leagues. So if there's a lot of license revenue being made, and they kind of share it in each one of these leagues. They share this across all teams, right? So it's kind of more like you have to pay the NFL, and then the NFL redistributes that evenly across teams. The NFL allows for teams to make individual side deals. For instance, I think the Cowboys, when I looked up, had some deals with Nike and Pepsi, but it's not very common that teams have a lot of high revenue generating side deals. And for the most part, these leagues are making the deals and then redistributing the money across evenly across teams. So when it comes to licensing revenue, because it's kind of going and operating through the league, this helps to kind of ensure that large, small markets have more similar revenue as well, right? Because they're all going to be getting paid kind of evenly with the exception of in the NFL, you have kind of these small side deals, right? So just to look at some numbers, I'll kind of get these up here before we go to the next slide. And I could not find these. I think 2018 was the last year they had this data. And then they stopped putting sports leagues in this top 100 licensed. It's like a organization that puts this out every year. But, you know, at the last time they put it out, you know, what was interesting to me is that Major League Baseball globally is actually making more money off their licensing deals, which maybe speaks to that. Maybe baseball's a little bit more of a globally, like, has more global interest than the NFL does. You know, $2 billion is quite a bit, you know, a higher additional revenue. So it must be that there's a little bit more global appeal. So this wasn't just money made in the US, this is money made globally. You can kind of see the other leagues here. You know, I thought it was kind of interesting to bring up some of these other small ones because they're actually pretty similar to the NHL. So the PGA actually makes more than the NHL off of their licensing deals. And then this one really got me that the WWE is like just barely below the, like they apparently make a good amount of money. Now I'm guessing this comes through things like video games, right? We'll kind of be paying pretty large amounts to have the right to use the official names, player likenesses and things. Oh, the other interesting one is that the Players Association actually makes more money off this licensing revenue than the NHL. So one of the things that the NFLPA has fought for is like, okay, for a while, the league was just selling players' likenesses and the league was making money, which in turn like benefited the players, but the players weren't getting to keep anything off of their likeness being sold. So they have a deal. I forget what year it started, but now the Players Association gets an amount of money and kind of redistributes it to players. And so they're actually generating you know, more money than the NHL even is. So kind of interesting there. And that might explain a little bit of why the NFL is so much lower than Major League Baseball, because the Players Association is keeping a pretty good chunk. They'd still be lower, but not quite as far below if you factored in how much money the Players Association is keeping there. Okay. So these are all, I think, just kind of thinking in general about what's going on here. I'll skip through this one quick because I really just want to focus on the naming rights. So, you know, we can think about venue revenue too. You've got parking, you've got sign ads within the stadium. You've got luxury boxes, right, which you can maybe sell for a slightly higher price. Then the one that I really want to focus on is a pretty good bulk of venue revenue is going to be naming rights, right? So, you know, I know that I only have my own experience. I know a little bit about other sports, but, you know, the White Sox, Chicago White Sox, I don't know how many times that stadium's changed names, but I don't even know what it is anymore. Like it's a new company every couple of years, right? So these teams sell off the rights to name their stadium because for that company, why was potentially that a good thing? Yeah.
It's like you say the stadium name first, and you say the NBA team. Like for example, Staples Center. You saying the crypto.
Yeah, right. Or everybody knows Wrigley Field is Wrigley Field, right? Like that. At one point in time, Wrigley was a company that owned the field, so or had the rights to the name. So, you know, this is a big money maker for these teams, and these companies get their name out there. They're said on national television every time that team plays. You know, people attending the game see it. So it's a lot of like not free advertising, but once they buy the rights, right, then it's like you're getting your name out there, you're getting some advertising. Right? So it's kind of interesting to look at, if I can get this to stop moving. There we go. So kind of looking at that naming rights and suites, I've got one paper we'll look at here, and then I kind of wanted to show you this just on the suites because it brings up an interesting point. So if I look at how much money the most expensive suites for each team sell for, San Francisco 49ers has the highest. Detroit's you know, struggling back here. But why might you expect Seattle, New York, San Francisco? Why is New York or LA not the highest when it comes to maybe these suite prices? Yeah.
Is it the alternatives? Like
So
there are more teams in New York.
Could be. New York is definitely maybe splitting, right? But what's something specific to San Francisco that might explain this?
I was gonna say stadium size.
So stadium size could impact this, but that's not what's driving San Francisco. What's located in San Francisco?
There's like a ton of rich people.
Exactly. right? Not necessarily just rich people, but when it comes to these suites, it's not generally one person buying the suites. Most of the suites are actually purchased by companies. Most of these companies have a suite, and then employees, can have opportunities. So a lot of these suites are being purchased by companies, and what's in San Francisco, so like close up to Silicon Valley, but all these tech, huge tech firms, and so they're really the ones that are driving this price up, right? Same kind of idea with Seattle, like Boeing's out in Seattle, and there's some other huge, companies. New York, obviously, I couldn't even name all the companies that are there, probably purchasing suites. And if you're thinking about cities that are struggling, right, in terms of maybe on the decline in terms of the companies that are there, Detroit, Cincinnati, maybe that's what we would expect. Right? Now, there's a bunch of factors that go into that, but that is one of the things that's driving San Francisco to be the highest. And if we pull up this link, I found this, and it's kind of an interesting little paper. It's not real academic, but it kind of walks through. It did a survey of a bunch of different teams and different companies, and it found notice who purchases the suites the most: banks, attorney, legal services, big law firms. You can kind of get the breakdown of different industries and how many of them are buying suites. There's another interesting one down here. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, there's something about the types of firm. It's kind of talking about how many of these, different industries, how many companies are actually owning suites. So it's kind of some interesting data. But really, the ultimate kind of conclusion of this is that, companies are probably really the ones that are driving a pretty substantial amount of that price for these luxury suites. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about, and I got a paper for this one as well, is naming rights, right? So I think there might be one, or I think maybe this didn't include SoFi at the time, so this might only be 5 now. But there's 5 NFL teams and 10 Major League Baseball stadiums that have not sold the naming rights to their stadium, right? So Oakland at one point had an offer, the company backed out. I forget exactly who it was now. So why are these 16 teams holding out, or 15, I guess now, right? Why are some of these teams choosing not to sell the rights to their stadium when we look at some of the deals, it's in the millions?
Very good right now.
So maybe, right, you think that you can get a higher price in the future. So you restrict supply today, right? Because you're holding out. But if I can make relatively short deals, like some of these deals, you'd be surprised they aren't for super that, maybe 5 years. And so why might another reason that I might not want to sell the rights to my stadium? I think so.
Right now with COVID, you would have a lower price that you'd be stuck with for that time.
For sure, right? So same idea, right? Higher expected prices. So what is something that might actually decrease my revenues in other areas if I sell my rights to the stadium?
Like if Chicago Cubs changed Wrigley Field's name, then the value would go up.
Yeah, so if we look at the teams that are holding out in Major League Baseball, it's not your kind of newer teams. It's your teams that have older stadiums that have so Fenway, Wrigley, right? The name of the stadium is generating some demand for that team. And so if they believe if they change that, potentially they lose some of their fan base, loyalty or interest. And so maybe they start to see a decrease in ticket revenue and revenue in some of these other areas, right? But that's really the only argument that you would make there, right? Either price expectations, like you think maybe if I hold out for a year or two, I can get a better deal, or potentially, right, you have kind of this loss of fans, right, or loss of money from fans in different revenue areas. Okay, so older stadiums are typically the ones that we see these teams holding out. Soldiers Field, Fenway, I had just kind of a couple of them. So this used to not be an aspect of professional sport revenue. The first rights were sold in '73, which if we look at now, that was a lot of money at the time. But for 25 years, pretty long contract. I would argue that probably wasn't a bad idea. Although I don't know what rich products are, so maybe they didn't even stay in business for all 25 years. Chase bought the Golden State Warriors rights for 15 to 20 million per year, and I forget how long that one was. AT&T, spending a bunch of money to have the naming rights to the Cowboys Stadium, and then United Airlines just bought the naming rights to the LA Coliseum. for 16-year periods. So I mean, a lot of, spending a pretty good amount of money here. They must believe that it's going to kind of bring in additional sales that make up for that, right? That's the only way that these costs will be justified. But what's interesting is there's these huge costs, so they must believe that they're going to increase, right, their profits or increase their sales because of this name recognition. The problem is, and I'll pull this paper up in a second, and they have this really nice table in here. The problem is a lot of these companies actually tend to not do so well after they kind of buy these rights, right? So they were looking at, and we'll look at the time period, I forget exactly what it was, but they had a pretty extensive analysis of all these different teams. And it looks like there's about a dozen or so of the companies that bought these naming rights either gave up the name because they, couldn't continue to pay year after year on the contract, or they went bankrupt. So a lot of these, companies that have purchased these naming rights, they went bankrupt. Well, hell, you could have saved a lot of money not spending it on the naming rights, right? So why might it not be that direction of a cause though? Why might it be like, how is, if I'm buying these naming rights, how does it actually hurt my company? But what could be the opposite?
I mean, it might hurt the company if the team is doing that, 'cause
Mhm.
especially in the single fill out. Recently changed the Pacers hasn't been good for like the last Paul George left, so
Yeah.
that's part of the reason.
Yeah, so part of it could be like I get associated with low quality, right? But let's say, why might the companies that buy naming rights be different than companies that don't? Maybe buying these naming rights is like a last ditch effort, right? Maybe they're already in financial distress and they believe this is going to be the thing that brings them out of it. So we might have a selection here where the companies decide to buy these rights. Maybe they were already kind of not doing so well. Now, there isn't great data to support that, but this is what this paper kind of proposes might be one of the selection things that's driving this. Yeah.
I was up here, but I was also going to say name recognition too, like how a State Farm Arena, a State Farm is so known, you could bring more fans in.
Well, that's for the team. The team actually would love that additional benefit as well, right? That having kind of a company it is doing well, it is well known, for sure. But for the company themselves, right, they just want to generate more revenue, right? They hope this generates more revenue for them. So if we go here and paste this, I've got another. This is the one that I posted up on Canvas under this week's readings. So we kind of can read through this little bit of an abstract here. So since the 1990s, an increasing number of teams have sold their rights to name their facilities. Authors use a one-step version of event analysis to show the naming rights do not have a lasting impact on the profits of the firm. Okay, so this is actually a pretty smart little study. So what they end up doing, and it might not be easy for us to, and here's that table I just showed you. So here, once again, I scroll down until I find an equation, right? And this equation is a little bit more difficult than what I would necessarily expect you to potentially be doing on your project, or even to have a perfect understanding of. But I'll break down this equation to make it a little bit easier for us. So what they were doing, and let me make sure I remember these variables correctly. I think I do. I think it was their stock price. It was R. So R is the daily, return for the stock. Okay. So we kind of think about the way that they're measuring the financial kind of health of these firms. They don't have actual revenue data or profit data from them, right? But they can look at their stock price, right? So they're going to look at their stock price, and I'll say this is on different days, which we kind of usually denote with a T, right? Different times or different days, right? They then have kind of their intercept. And then what they did was they had a different coefficient. And then this variable was simply an identifier. And it was a 1-0 variable for different days, whether or not it was 1 day after the announcement of the names being bought, 2 days after the announcement of the name being bought, 3 days after the announcement, right? And so each day is going to have its own coefficient. So each day you can kind of see, okay, 1 day out, what was the impact of buying these naming rights? 2 days out, what was the effect, right? Because the only way this variable is a 1 is if I purchase the naming rights on that day, or like, every time period before the day I bought it, it will just be a 0, right? And the only time this is a 1 is if it's 1 day after, then that's a 1. If it's 2 days after, well, now the 1 day identifier is a 0, but the 2 day identifier is a 1. So we can use those coefficients to say, okay, this many days after the event occurred or the naming rights were bought, how much did the stock price change? Okay. So they kind of present that in a not so nicest way. And here they had like the list of when all these teams sold their naming rights. Some companies actually have, there's multiple teams that maybe play in the same place. So where is the other table? Here it is. So ultimately what they did was they said, okay, well, let's give this some time to kind of take effect, right? So what they did was they looked at what was the effect in the stock price the day after the announcement, right? Or as they said announcement day, but it's like the full day after, whenever it was. Like if it was announced at 8 o'clock at night, they used the next day, right? The next business or whenever the stock market would be open. They then said, okay, we're also going to look at the identifier on the 41st day. We're going to see 41 days after the announcement, so over a month, has there been any change in the stock price? Because now we've given that company 41 days to increase, how much they're selling or increase the price they're selling it for, to increase revenues that should then be factored into their stock price. Okay. So what's interesting, and here is where the last week's paper was kind of a pain, but I kind of mentioned when we're thinking about, are these impacts any different from 0? We're really looking to see is the p-value less than alpha. Right? Our alpha levels were 0.01, 0.05, 0.01. I think did I say 0.01 twice? Whatever, I've got them written down. You can kind of follow me here. And we can start to say that at these different significance levels, I found there's a statistically significant effect, right? Of being 41 days out from naming the stadium on my stock prices, right? The effect of how many days out we are on my stock price. The way that we usually denote this is next to, whenever we see our coefficient, 1 star means 10%, 2 stars means 5, and then 3 means 1. And another way we can think about this is like 90% confidence, 95, and 99% confidence. Okay. So we want to see 3 stars. 3-star tells us this is a very significant effect. There's a very significant relationship between stock price and how many days out from naming that or buying those stadium naming rights is. So when we look here, the interest, we'll get an announcement effect first. So we go through here. Some of them, there's like no effect, right? This is negative 0.001, but there's no stars. It's not statistically any different from 0, right? Remember, if we get these stars, we're saying we can reject that there's no relationship between being on the day of the announcement of buying these rights on the stock prices, right? So most of these are 0, right? So, but the ones that aren't, right? We've got a positive and significant coefficient here, positive and significant, positive, right? The only ones that we get any significance on are always kind of positive. Looks like there is a positive impact on stock prices after these teams buy the naming rights, which I don't know if there's been any recent, but this might be a good way to make a little bit, exploit the market a little bit, that maybe they're not factoring this in, that you typically see the stock price go up. Maybe then you short it, right? Because, and if you're not sure what that means, right? It's like I promise to kind of sell it down the road because I believe the price is going to drop, right? Or I promise to buy it. Right? I'm shorting a stock. I'm saying that I think that the price is going to go down in the future, right? And the reason why that might be a good thing to do here is because I've got a positive effect on the day after the announcement, but 41 days after, look at the effect. Is anything significant here? The only one that's significant is negative, right? And a lot of these, even though they're not significant, there's a lot of negative effects here, right? Now, can't say they're any different from 0, but there's only one of them here. So what this is really telling me is that the day after, people overreact to this news, the stock price goes up, but then in the long run, they realize oh yeah, the company hasn't changed its way. It's all they just decided to purchase naming rights. They're still producing the product in the same way. They're still, the same cost structure for their employees. Nothing's changed 41 days out, and the stock price goes back to what it was. Yeah.
Do you think there's a relationship between like if the team is doing bad and the naming rights, or if the company?
There could be. So maybe if I parse this out, maybe the ones where I see this positive effect were only at teams that were performing well. You could definitely do that. You would basically, I won't go into it today. We'll look at a paper that looks at interaction effects, but that would be kind of, there is a way to do it. Or you could just separate them out and run the regression twice and see if it's any different.
That goes the same with like attendance. If let's say the naming rights, they're receiving backlash or something.
Yeah. Maybe you see attendance. Yeah, you could also look at the relationship between naming rights. I think like maybe actually a really fun study would be if you could find a handful of scandals maybe with some of these companies and see if like attendance at those stadiums goes down after the scandal. But you would do it a similar way. Instead of announcement of the naming rights, you would have announcement of the company scandal or something like that. Yep. And that's really all that is here. I think they show one company specifically, and then they graph out these coefficients on every single day. So they did an identifier for every single day, and you can kind of see the stock price. When they purchased it initially, maybe it goes up a little bit, but then things don't get any better, and eventually kind of goes back, right, or goes back down. So that was that. We've talked a little bit about all this, so I'm just going to kind of leave this up on the screen, and then I'm going to kind of try to show you, relate to what we were talking about today with revenue sharing to what we were talking about last class with the optimal number of wins. Okay. So, we've talked about these different areas of revenue, how some of the revenue in different areas is being shared, and it's a little bit different throughout the rest of, across these different leagues. But for the most part, they all have some mechanism through which revenue sharing is occurring. Right? Now, the problems with revenue sharing is just the general intuition is that you've now decreased the incentive for large market teams, which tend to be your higher quality teams, to really put in as much effort. Because I don't get to keep every dollar I make now, I only get to keep 60 cents. Same idea, they talk about the income tax, right? If you raise the income tax to 100%, if you make over $1 million, nobody's going to make over $1 million, right? They're going to stop right at $1 million because anything past that, they just have to pay it all back, right? So you disincentivize these higher, larger market teams from really trying to raise as much revenue. But then your lower quality teams also have lower incentive because now they can put in zero effort and get money from the league, right? So I don't want to become, if I climb up the ranks, eventually I'm going to be getting less money from the league and paying more in. So there's less of an incentive for these lower quality or lower market teams, smaller market teams, to really raise revenues as much as well. So it's very similar to the income tax. And you would think of like, if you look at maybe some political terminology, they talk about there being like a welfare class, right, when it comes to the income tax. Well, here some people have alluded to these small market teams. It's really a welfare class of teams, right? They just start to not try to make more optimal decisions to raise more revenue. They just start relying on the revenue sharing or these transfers that are coming to them from the league. Okay. So I want to kind of give you a visual of this and think about how this is going to impact teams. So why might revenue sharing be a bad or a good thing? Okay. So we started talking about the win market last class, and we'll keep marginal cost constant just to make the math a little bit easier for something I'm about to show you. So let's say here's the marginal cost of a win. We then said, here's my demand curve. Here's my marginal revenue curve. Okay. So before we could think about as kind of our demand curve as being, I didn't go into this last class, but we can think of it as being our average total revenue. So why is that the case? Well, total revenue is price times quantity. Average total revenue is just total revenue over quantity. So you can kind of see here, if I plug this in, I'm going to get and I shouldn't be using quantity here, I apologize. I'm really thinking about the number of wins. I kind of default to quantity sometimes. So I would have something like this, where this cancels, and right, the price is really, I could plug in my demand function. So really my demand curve becomes my average total revenue. And so that was another reason why we then kind of wrote out profits and said this was going to be the point where profits were equal to 0. Okay. So if the league comes in and says we're going to have some revenue sharing, right? What's going to happen is for every dollar I earn now, for every average total revenue dollar I earn, I don't get to keep all of it, right? I'm going to have to pay a fraction to the league. Now, for some of these leagues, it's different, but we'll use, like, you can kind of imagine Major League Baseball, I said they get to keep 69%. So really, whatever this demand curve is, the new demand curve that they're going to make decisions off of, the additional revenue they can make, their marginal revenue they can make, is going to be whatever it was before times 0.69. Right? They only get to keep 69% of it. So you're going to see kind of a decrease here in that demand curve because I'm not going to keep every dollar I make. So maybe now the new demand curve is down here, marginal revenue right here. And now it doesn't matter if they're profit or win maximizing. I kind of drew these kind of perfect here, but before, the profit maximizing number of wins, right, was right there where marginal cost was equal to marginal revenue. Now the profit maximizing number of wins after revenue sharing is going to be lower for that large market team, right? Because they're going to be paying in, right? But they're not really going to be getting as much back in return, right? They're paying more revenue in than they are getting revenue transfers. There you go, right? So maybe it doesn't shift completely like from like 100% to 69% because they are getting some of the money back, but they're going to be paying more in than they'll receive back in return. Okay? So you can kind of think about this is what's going to happen for large market teams. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. All right, so we're going to see a similar thing happen for these small market teams. However, so we'll have demand, marginal revenue. So now we're thinking of kind of small market teams. Now, they're going to have to pay in a certain percentage of their income as well. But just for a second, I'm going to assume that away so I can make another point to you. So let's assume that we have these league transfers and we have revenue sharing. But here I'll add in one more assumption. Let's assume that our small market teams can't get any like local broadcast deals, right? They can't generate any of this additional revenue. And so they're not paying anything in, right? So we think about the Major League Baseball was 69% of your local broadcast you have to keep, so you paid in 31%. Well, if I don't have any local broadcast deals, how much am I paying in? 0, right? So let's assume for a second that the small market teams didn't pay anything in. They're only receiving money from the league. So there, the only reason why we saw that kind of like shift in demand for the large market teams is because they were keeping less of their revenue than they were before. Well, now here, small market teams, they're not generating any revenue in that area, so local broadcast deals that gets to be shared. So their demand curve stays the same. However, they're given this lump sum of money from the league. So now what is total revenue? Total revenue is going to be, I think about it as price of a win, and price of a win is a little bit abstract. It's like how much revenue is being made in all these areas from one additional win. But they're also getting this additional revenue sharing or this additional kind of revenue transfer from the league. So I'll just call that S. It's like shared revenue there. So now what happens is, right, that as I win more games, that difference in between what total revenue used to be, or kind of average total revenue kind of being my demand curve, now my average total revenue is a little bit higher than the demand curve. Remember before, without any league transfers, my demand curve was average total revenue. But now if I try to do the same thing, right, average total revenue is total revenue over the number of wins or over quantity. Well, now I'll end up with, it is the demand curve, but also plus this additional amount, right? So now if we think about profit maximization, the league gave these teams a bunch of money, right? So for the small market teams, the profit maximizing point isn't going to change at all, right? Because the marginal revenue hasn't changed, right? The additional revenue from an additional win hasn't changed at all, because that amount of money I was given doesn't depend on the number of wins. The amount of money the league gave me, I could win 0 games and I still have that much money. So now, if we're profit maximizing, giving this money to the small market teams hasn't changed their behaviors at all. It's not going to help improve the competitive balance of the league, because they're just going to pocket the money, right? If I can win the same number of games, right, without spending additional money, and I get to keep this additional revenue the league gave me, I'm just going to keep winning the same number of games and just pocket that money. I'm not going to spend it on my players, right? I'm at the point where I'm maximizing profits from the thing I can change. Now, if I'm win maximizing, before, the win maximizing point would have been right here. So we'll kind of call this, so these would be like the initial points. And then after the transfers, right, so with the revenue share, the profit maximizing point didn't change at all, right? However, the point where profits are equal to 0 is now a little bit further out. And that's because I now have this additional money I can spend that the league gave me. So if I'm just trying to maximize wins, I've got everything I had before, but now I've got this additional component as well, right? And we can kind of walk through why that's the point where profits are equal to 0. So just to kind of give an idea, if we're thinking about total revenues minus total cost, this represented my profits. With these league transfers, my total revenue is price times number of wins plus this amount of money the league gave me. My total costs are, well, I've got a constant marginal cost. So it's the marginal cost times the number of wins. Sorry, this is supposed to be a W. And I could rearrange this a little bit so that I've got plus S, right? So the point at where profits are going to be equal to 0, we could kind of back this out. So it'll end up being, what do I want here? Average total revenue is equal to marginal cost. So if I take average total revenue is equal to costs. Oh, I could just do it this way. Sorry. Then this cancels. So this represents my average total revenue. So when my average total revenue is equal to that marginal cost, that's the point where profits are going to be equal to 0. So I've got this kind of average total revenue curve now, and I'm not going to like make you reproduce any of this. I'm just kind of trying to give an insight in behind the equations why that's going on. But basically, because I have constant marginal cost, the point where this average total revenue curve hits my marginal cost curve, I know that's the point at which profits would be equal to 0. It'd be a little bit different if I had increasing marginal costs. The math would be a little bit tougher because this marginal cost wouldn't be a constant value down here, but you know, fairly easy enough. I think the intuition makes sense, right? I'm given this lump sum of money from the league. So if I'm profit maximizing, I'm just going to stay at the same point and pocket the money and increase my profits. If I'm win maximizing, I now spend that additional money the league gave me up until my profits are 0. I've ran out of all this additional money they gave me, and I'm at a slightly higher number of targeted wins. So if large, small market teams are win maximizing, then this revenue sharing can kind of help decrease that gap. If they're profit maximizing, they're not going to change their behaviors at all. We've just taken money from our large market teams and just put it in the pockets of the small market teams. So we'll revisit this starting on Tuesday, and we'll kind of think about some more of the issues going on with revenue sharing. So if you try to tackle those last 2 questions in the homework, it may make a little bit more sense after next week. But I think at least you could probably get a pretty good chunk of them done for our problems 5 and 6 after just this discussion that we had today. We'll revisit on Tuesday. Okay? So start thinking about proposal ideas if you haven't reached out to me yet. If you have any questions or need help thinking of an idea, please let me know. Other than that, if you need help on the homework, shoot me an email or stop by my office. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday.